Welcome to On Our Watch, a podcast about coastal erosion and sustainability in Louisiana, as well as the implications for coastal systems worldwide. My name is Marian Evans. I'm a filmmaker and a producer of the documentary On Our Watch, a feature-length film about Louisiana's coastal land loss crisis. The film's director, Jonathan Evans, and I are proud to produce this podcast series that will continue to explore important coastal issues through conversations with local residents, community leaders, and experts. In this episode, we're speaking with Michael Massimi. Michael is the Invasive Species and Marine Programs Coordinator at the Barataria-Terrebonne National Estuary Program, also known as BTNEP. He currently manages projects to conduct research, outreach, and public education on invasive species. And now, our interview with Michael Massimi. Thank you so much, Michael, for coming here today. So you are the Invasive Species and Marine Programs Coordinator at BTNEP, which is the Barataria-Terrebonne National Estuary Program. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you first became interested in this type of work.
Well, thank you for having me, first of all, and I appreciate being here. I grew up in Algiers, New Orleans, and from an early age, I love the outdoors. I've always kind of been an environmentally minded person. My mom took me fishing a few times down at Myrtle Grove when I was a little kid. Not that I'm an avid fisherman or anything compared to most of the people around here, but, just sort of growing up here and loving the natural environment. I worked at the Audubon Nature Institute Aquarium for several years in the late 90s. I've always been interested in animals and wildlife. And I met Carrie St. Pé, one of the former directors of the estuary program, when there happened to be a job opening. And that just kind of serendipitously worked out.
Yeah, so it's just kind of an innate interest in you from a young age.
Definitely, an innate interest from a young age, in preserving this place. And, of course, in the late 80s and 90s, it was becoming really clear how fast this place was disappearing. And you could actually see the evidence in your lifetime of disappearing places and landmarks. So it became really clear that this place needed help.
Yeah, when you can actually see it change, that really puts it in perspective.
Definitely.
For you. So for people who may not be familiar, can you give us some background on what BTNEP is and how it functions and what its primary purpose is as an organization?
Yes, so BTNEP, as you mentioned, is the Barataria-Terrebonne National Estuary Program. So I'll explain a couple of things. First, Barataria-Terrebonne, it's all of the land between the Mississippi and the Atchafalaya River. So it's west bank of New Orleans, West Baton Rouge, all the way up to False River is the northern part of the Terrebonne Estuary. And then our western boundary is the Atchafalaya all the way down to Morgan City and the entire Gulf Coast between Morgan City and Venice, basically, or Southwest Pass. So it's a 4.2 million acre area comprising the two basins, the Barataria and the Terrebonne, which are sort of hydrologically distinct. Bayou Lafourche runs down the center and is the barrier between the two basins. So both of those basins were designated as National Estuary back in 1990 with a nomination letter from then Governor Romer. And we're one of 28 national estuary programs administered under the EPA. So back around that time in the late 80s, it was noted that estuaries are significant, and they're significant for a lot of different reasons. The natural resources, there's often sheltered harbors. It's important for recreation, for business and industry. In our case, we have people living here, and special protections were carved out in the Clean Water Act. So it was literally an act of Congress that established the national estuary programs. There's several others on the Gulf Coast. Mobile Bay has a program, Galveston has a program, and there's a lot on the East Coast and West Coast as well. Puerto Rico even has a national estuary program. And most of these areas have, their threats are mostly development or, sea level rise. Each one has sort of unique issues to their specific geography. But in our case, we have this rapid subsidence that's a major problem. Our land is sinking faster than sea level rise is rising. So we've been aware of this problem of disappearing land for a long time. And we also have a very populated coast where a lot of people not only live now, but have lived for hundreds of years, and cultures that go back hundreds of years, or in some cases thousands of years, that we want to preserve and protect. So cultural preservation is also a part of the National Estuary Program, as well as conservation of the habitats.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to ask you a real basic question. Can you explain what an estuary is? And I mean, you explained a little bit, but why is this particular area so important?
Well, an estuary is technically, it's where freshwater meets the sea. So it's where rivers meet the sea. And usually a delta is created. As rivers transport sediment down to the ocean, they create a delta. There's all of these other riverine processes like crevasses and lobe switching that build new land on the delta. And estuaries are, mixing of freshwater and nutrients from the land with the marine environment of the sea. And that mixing of water chemistries and habitat types create a very, very productive and diverse habitat. There's usually shelter for harbors or ports. There's nurseries for fisheries. Estuaries are often called the nurseries of the sea because a lot of organisms from the marine environment come into the sheltered estuaries for reproduction and raising their young. It's important for commercial fisheries, fisheries of all types, but especially the commercially important ones in South Louisiana. Oysters, shrimp, crabs especially, depend on the estuaries for their life cycle. And recreation, and then also business and industry. The estuary here is where we've built our roads, built our homes, built our communities, and also all of the onshore and offshore oil and gas. Navigation, of course, is a big one. The Mississippi River is the lifeblood of the nation's economy. So a lot of important reasons why you would carve out estuaries for special protection.
Yeah. And so you work with invasive species. So what do we mean when we say invasive species, and what are some examples of the different types of invasive species that exist in this area?
Yeah, so invasive species is a somewhat complicated topic. First off, I should probably distinguish between exotic and invasive. So organisms that are native to an area and have been there for as long as records go back are considered native, and we generally don't consider them harmful. Sometimes they can behave in aggressive ways, especially certain plants. But it's when you bring organisms into your area from an outside area and introduce them. So introduced or exotic or non-native are kind of synonyms for all the same thing. You bring an organism, a plant or an animal or some other organism, into an area. Most of the time they don't like it, right? They're outside of their native range and they don't usually survive. But a fraction of them do survive, and a fraction of those survive and reproduce and really like it here and outcompete the natives. So exotic just means from somewhere else. It doesn't necessarily mean that the organism is causing harm. Invasive is the term we use when we start noticing that the organism is reproducing and causing harm and outcompeting our native species.
Great. So it could be plants or it could be habitat. Like, what are some of the different types of invasive species?
Yeah, basically any type of organism is considered an invasive species. So there's invasive funguses and bacteria, there's invasive corals, but mostly we're talking about plants and animals, the types of things that you would actually go out and have a control program to fight against. The classic example in Louisiana is the nutria. Which is a rodent that was introduced in the 1930s for its fur. It was to bolster the fur industry, which was already a pretty significant, economically important industry in Louisiana at the time. And then nutria made it even more so. There was a time when we were harvesting millions of nutria out of the coast. The price per pelt was $8, $9, $10. I believe it went up to $14 a pelt at one point in the 70s. But then, of course, there was an anti-fur movement. Market saturation, if you have a fur coat, you probably don't need a second one. And some political issues in the Eastern Europe and Russia, which led to the decline of nutria fur markets worldwide in the 80s and 90s. And so the price per pelt collapsed. There was no demand. And then if there's no demand and no economy for the pelt, then people stop hunting them and trapping them. They're rodents, of course, so they reproduce like crazy. And then we started noticing major problems with nutria eating the marsh in the 80s and 90s when the demand started to collapse.
And so how do you combat, the problems with nutria or other invasive plants? How do you deal with these types of problems from invasive species?
So with nutria specifically, there's a long history of trying lots of different things. They wanted to use poison baits or birth control baits, but it's difficult to apply in the field without impacting non-target species. There was a $2 million effort around the year 2000 to promote it for human consumption. But the list of natural resources that we're sitting on top of here in our coastal environment is pretty long before you get down to a nutria. So it was kind of a hard sell. It was more like, I'll give you $2 million if you eat this kind of a thing. So that didn't really take off. But then in 2002, they started the Coastwide Nutria Control Program. So that's funded through another congressional act, CWIPR, the Coastal Wetlands Planning and Protection Act. And it's been funding renewed for 20 years now. And it's administered through the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. And they have an area basically south of I-10 and I-12 where they arrange permissions with landowners, have people register for the program, and then pay them a bounty. So it's an artificial cost given to the trappers and the hunters for the tail of the nutria. It started out at $4 a tail, went up to $5, now it's up to $6. And there are some people who register for the program who make tens of thousands of dollars a year just on nutria tails alone. And the program does a world of good. The amount of acres damaged by nutria used to approach 100,000 acres a year. A lot of that acreage didn't recover and converted to open water. So on top of our already serious linchpin issue of coastal land loss, you have nutria causing all this additional damage. But now the damage is less than 10,000 acres a year because of the Coastwide Nutria Control Program. So as part of that program, other than paying the bounty to the trappers, they also fly helicopter transects along the coast every year, the same transect, so they can monitor the amount of nutria damage. The problem with nutria is they eat the basal portions of the plant, the roots. We have a native similar species, the muskrat, but they prefer to eat the leaves and the plant can recover. Muskrat damage more easily recovers in the marsh than nutria damage, where they eat the root, destroys the plant loses its hold on the soil washes away, you have open water.
So I know that you also deal with coastal restoration and protection work as part of your role at BTNEP. So what does that look like for you, and what kinds of projects are you involved in?
Well, I was involved with the master planning process in 2012 with CPRA, and in 2017. I took a break from BTNEP and moved to Washington, D.C. for a little while, but I came back and got my old job back. At BTNEP in general, our main involvement in the coastal restoration is our plant materials program. So we have a farm in Thibodaux where we grow most of the woody species for a lot of the coastal restoration projects. So when they do ridge project, in a marsh, you're planting mostly grasses for marsh restoration, but on the ridges, you want woody species to grow on top of those ridges. So CPRA has been doing a lot of ridge restoration, and BTNEP provides a lot of the plant materials for those ridges.
Okay, great. How would you say that BTNEP feels about the Mid-Barataria Sediment Diversion Project, and what would that mean for the estuary if implemented?
So the Mid-Barataria Sediment Diversion Project is very complicated. Anytime there's a large-scale public works project like this, there's going to be some massive changes, some winners and some losers. So historically, BTNEP's been kind of skeptical of that project, mainly due to the cost and the impacts to fisheries and the potential impacts to flooding. And we also see that there's devastating changes coming regardless of a lot of this restoration as well, with coastal sea level rise, land loss. So there's going to be change in the estuary. The idea behind the project is, we're doing a lot of these marsh creation projects, we're doing a lot of these ridge projects and islands, but over the long term, to sustain what you've built, you need net inputs of new sediment coming from the river. That's the goal. Obviously, it's going to really freshen the basin too, because you can't bring in those sediments without a lot of fresh water. So we have right now estuarine conditions. Some years it's fresher, some years it's saltier, but for the most part, it's a very productive area for oysters, which prefer that sort of mid-brackish zone. And if you put enough fresh water into the Barataria Basin, you're not going to have oysters anymore. So a lot of the opposition comes from the oyster industry and other fisheries, and those communities and interest groups sit on our management conference. And so BTNEP is kind of a bottom-up organization. We're run by a management conference, kind of like a board of directors. It's a very varied organization. There's 50 entities on it. The fisheries are represented, academia is represented, all the state and federal resource agencies are represented. So among our management conference and among our staff, program office staff as well, there's a variety of opinions, some more fervently for the diversion and some more fervently against.
So there's probably not one opinion from BTNEP. You have a lot of different voices coming in.
Correct. Yeah. The entire restoration community is not monolithic on this project. There's a lot of diverging opinions, and I would say that would apply to BTNEP as well.
Right. What would you say that you like most about your job and what you do?
Oh, that's a great question. I really love the people that I work with. I really love the history and the culture of the very different cultures all within the Barataria and Terrebonne. And I like getting out into the field. I mean, who doesn't love to go walk through a swamp or trudge through a marsh or get out on a boat, visit the waterways, go out to the barrier islands. The birding is fantastic. Marine mammals, sea turtles. So that's what keeps me going.
Yeah. Do you have any upcoming projects that you're particularly excited about right now? Anything coming up?
Yes. So BTNEP is working with Nicholls State University on a Head Start program for the Diamondback terrapin. So some of your listeners might be familiar with Head Start programs. They're used with sea turtles often. So sea turtles lay a lot of eggs. Almost all of those eggs hatch, but the hatchlings are highly vulnerable to predation before they make it back to the ocean. So head starting is basically you hatch them in controlled conditions, and when they're slightly larger and less susceptible to predation, you release them and you get a much higher reproduction rate that way. So the Diamondback terrapin is not a sea turtle, but it's a brackish water turtle that's native to the Gulf Coast. Very charismatic animal, kind of like the puppies of the salt marsh. We have a lot of problems with terrapin mortality. They get struck by cars, they get trapped in crab traps. So we're starting a program with Nicholls to do a Head Start program. Dr. Tim Clay at Nicholls State University will collect eggs from terrapin nests, hatch them in incubators. We're going to go into classrooms and let some public schools classrooms in the area raise the turtles individually, and when they're a certain age near the end of the year, we're going to take the students out and go release them back into the wild. And I think this will have a positive benefit on outreach and education with the kids, teaching them about the marsh, teaching them about diamondback terrapins, and a positive impact on the terrapin population as well, which is the goal.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. I would love that if I was in school to help raise turtles.
Yeah, and at the end of the year, we're going to go out to a marsh and release it. Yeah, I think it's going to be really neat.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for talking to me today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to On Our Watch. We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Michael Massimi. Don't forget to subscribe to On Our Watch on your favorite podcast app to be notified about future episodes. You can find our feature-length documentary On Our Watch, as well as a video version of today's episode, in the links below. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll be back with another episode next week. This podcast is made possible through support from the Greater New Orleans Foundation and executive produced by Bruno UK Steiner.